What I'm going to talk about now is the way in which Britain is intimately connected to Israeli violence and how there is a moral imperative for us to extricate Britain from that relationship. I also want to delve slightly into the way in which Israel is intimately involved in British violence as well, in the same token. If we look at the First World War, this was a period when, someone like Avi Schleim, for example, when we talk about Nakba al-Mustamirra, the beginning of the Nakba, as far as Avi Schleim is concerned, was really at a pivotal stage in the First World War, but not just for the reason of the Balfour Declaration, which is well known by all of us here, I'm sure. It is credited with being procured in Britain by a biochemist by the name of Chaim Weizmann. Now, Chaim Weizmann played quite an important role doing something in Britain that was quite vital to Britain's war effort at that time. Now, you had a situation where a certain smokeless gunpowder was used in the British Army. Now, because of the fact that they had gone to war with obviously Germany on the other side, they were no longer able to import what they needed for this gunpowder, the cordite, which was used for the gunpowder. So Weizmann, being a biochemist, came up with a way of a fermentation process that converted starch, which was readily available in corn and potatoes, into acetone. Now, acetone was vital to this smokeless gunpowder that Britain needed, and what it became known as was the Weizmann process, and was in fact industrialized not only in Britain but Canada and in the United States. This process of fermentation. And that was part of it. Of course, Weizmann had been working, and the campaign to procure the Balfour Declaration had been something that was struggled against by people like Edwin Montagu in the British cabinet at the time, but it had some role in the eventual procurement of the Balfour Declaration. If we look at what is known as the quote-unquote Jewish battalions or legion in World War I in the British Army, there are three interesting characters that were trained and weaponized and took part in the British war effort. Number one, Vladimir Jabotinsky. Number two, Ben Gurion, formerly Ben Green. And number three, the son of Herbert Samuel, who Herbert Samuel himself went on to be the first High Commissioner of Palestine and implemented the Balfour Declaration through the British Mandate. That was the division of the society. It laid the foundation for what today is the apartheid state. But when we look at Ben Gurion being trained and weaponized by the British Army, we look at Vladimir Jabotinsky being weaponized by the British Army, we have the spectrum, in a way, of what later became, quote-unquote, the left and the right of the Zionist movement. Both of them had roots in their violence within the British Army, and this is really an important point to make. Douglas Duff, who was a British general in Palestine during the Mandate period, and this was, the word to duff someone up came into English casual language, shall we say, from the experience of Duff in Palestine, and the way particularly that the 36 strike, heroic strike, one of the longest strikes in recorded human history, was put down. But Douglas Duff has an interesting quote about the period. He said, "Most of us were so infected by the sense of our own superiority over lesser breeds that we scarcely regarded these people as human. The police dubbed all Palestinians, regardless of religion, as wogs." Now, during the 36 revolt, not only did you have this idea of Palestinians as wogs, you also had them referred to by the British as Uzulbats. Now, where does Uzulbats come from? It comes from the Palestinian, the Arabic word isabat, gangs. So the idea that the Palestinians, and especially those resisting the British, had already been kind of gangsterized, and simultaneously you had the realization that the Palestinians needed to be demobilized and demilitarized. But then on the other side, as we're just about to get into, you had a character, Ord Wingate, who really set about militarizing and as Avi Schleim makes the point, this was when the infrastructure and the skeleton of the IDF that later would take form was established at the hands of the British in 1936. Wingate came and You know, you also had the British using, as was spoken to so articulately earlier, the way in which many of Israel's practices today are in fact, if not residue, imitations and innovations on top of British styles of suppression that were perfected throughout the Mandate period. So you had the habit where the British would take captive Palestinians and use them as minesweepers in front of the British army in a style similar to what we see today of human shields being used. Particularly we've seen it in Gaza and in other contexts as well. So according to Yigal Allon in his book The Making of Israel's Army, Ord Wingate, who came with the purpose of putting down the Palestinian rebellion and helping to militarize the Zionist gangs at that time, was that he saw himself as, quote unquote, in practice, a member of the Haganah. Hugh Foote, who was Britain's official in Palestine in the 30s, actually accused Wingate of wiping out opposition gangs by killing them all, quote unquote, and launching a dirty war of assassination and counter-assassination at the time. We know that he insisted on speaking broken and in some contexts it seems not even understandable form of Hebrew. We know that he stripped and whipped Palestinians naked in Haifa. And we know that Moshe Dayan, the implementer of Plan Dalit in 1948, and the defense minister, quote unquote, in 1967, said, "We are all Wingate's children." So here we have the direct relationship between Israeli violence and British tutelage, as it were. The most famous British soldier who took part in the quashing of the revolt was a man called Bernard Montgomery, and he said of the Palestinian enemy, quote unquote, "They must be hunted down and killed relentlessly. We must not be on the defensive and act only when attacked. We must take the offensive and impose our will upon the rebels." The revolt, all in all, cost 5,000 Palestinian lives, and the casualties were higher on a per capita basis than those inflicted by Israel during the First and Second Intifada. Alan Cunningham, who was the final British High Commissioner at the time, actually asserted that during that period of, again, this intimate linkage between British military structures and Zionist gangs, you saw around 2,000 Arab buildings demolished for punitive reasons from 1936 to 1940. Of course, later on you had the killing of Walter Guinness in Cairo and the bombing of the King David Hotel. You had examples, this was of course after the White Paper, when Zionist gangs would kidnap, kill British soldiers, then booby-trap their bodies. However, that didn't stop. In the Nakba, as put forward by Ilan Pape, Britain played, quote-unquote, a truly diabolical role. Now, what did he mean by that? He means, and was referring to, the tendency that it seemed amongst the British to protect only areas that they would be reliant upon for their escape route, rather than protecting other areas. Of course, we know that the forces were massively unbalanced in terms of Palestinians to Zionist gangs, obviously later making up the Israeli army. Cyril Marriott, who was the British Consul General in Haifa at the time, told the government that a Zionist attack on the city was expected in the next day or so. But the British aim should be to, quote-unquote, safeguard the route and installations which will be essential for safe evacuation of our forces and let Jews and Arabs fight it out. Because if they were to intervene in the fighting in any way, it would harm British prestige in the world if they were to lose soldiers in this situation. General Hugh Stockwell was the British military commander at the time, and he took good care to keep Haifa as allotted to Israel. And even used the word, he wanted Haifa to remain a clean city, i.e. a Palestinian-free city. Not remain, but to be a clean city. So in that way, coming into this language of ethnic cleansing. And of course, Stockwell actually pressured the Palestinians to accept the Haganah's condition of ceasefire. You know, it's the full handover of weapons, the imposition of a curfew, and the assembly of all quote-unquote foreign Arab males at a place designated by the Haganah. And the weapons would be collected by the British and then handed over to the Haganah on May 15th. As the evacuation, which was eventually negotiated, took place, the Haganah even fired on ambulances, ransacked the hospital, and looted Palestinian homes. The British continually claimed that the Palestinians had been, quote unquote, infiltrated by Iraqis and Syrians and foreign gangs. When Ben Gurion visited Haifa, he referred to it as a corpse city and described it as a horrifying, fantastic sight, which can happen elsewhere if we hold out. In 1948, you also had a situation which has not really received much attention, I would say, by historians, but is referred to by Mike Tepperson, who was the director of the Mahal Museum. Now, Mahal is an acronym in Hebrew for foreign volunteers, and they were groups of people that came and fought in the Zionist effort and then did not claim citizenship and left. Their sole purpose was to come and serve in that situation. Now, as Mike Tepperson puts it, the people that came were almost all World War II veterans who fought on the side of the Allies. And he also says that the British had purposely kept Palestinians away from real training and real understanding of weaponry. So hence you even had some of the, as we know, 2.5 million Indians fought for the British in World War II. Some Indians came and participated in the Zionist effort and came through the British army to come to Palestine and take part in that. We know that the United States and the Soviet Union, Truman recognizing Israel at 3 a.m., but the British waited a year. Because for them, according to Bevin, it would be something that they just needed a little bit of distance from and could not really afford in terms of their reputation on the international scene to be too close to Israel at that time. Folke Bernadotte, the Swedish diplomat, was sent by the UN to look at a partition plan, and he had actually urged that Palestinian refugees should be able to return home at the earliest possible date or receive financial compensation if they chose not to. Resolution 194. He was assassinated on September 16th by the Stern Gang in Jerusalem. You had what then formed between the United States, Britain and France what was called the Tripartite Declaration. And they agreed between themselves that they would assess all arms sales either to Israel or neighboring Arab countries because of the nature of the conflict at that time. However, during that period, Israel continued to exert pressure on Britain, and licenses were granted for the export of 6 Centurions, the tanks, from Britain to Israel. But their delivery was in fact blocked when Israel invaded Gaza in 1955. However, that measure did not apply to Meteor fighter jets, which Britain delivered 5 of them to Israel during the first 3 months of that invasion of Gaza. Not only that, within days of that invasion, the British Foreign Office said they had no problem with France sending 20,000 rifles to Israel. So we see that this tripartite declaration of 1950 didn't really seem to stand for much, and it would get a little more complicated as we got into 1956. You had a clash between one conception of policy regarding particularly Abdel Nasser and Israel. One conception was the Operation Stockpile, which is whereby the CIA sat down and designed a way for Israel to provoke war in some way, and then that would give them the reason to sell weapons to the Israelis. But this was also against another vision that the US had, which was Operation Omega, which was while they wanted to politically isolate Jamal Abdel Nasser, they also would not seek to militarily give Israel any upper hand at that stage because they would isolate him, but at the same time hope to woo him somewhat, particularly away from the Soviet Union, who he was becoming increasingly close to, and China. So when Jamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, it infuriated Britain. As we know, 2/3 of Britain's entire annual oil supply passed through the canal. And even the Labour leader at the time, Hugh Gateskill, compared Jamal Abdel Nasser to Mussolini. in Parliament. The tripartite aggression in 1956 of Britain, France and Israel against Egypt was really the end of the tripartite declaration. France, in fact, promised Israel $100 million in weaponry if it assisted them in hitting FLN bases in Libya, to which Ben-Gurion and the Israelis gladly agreed. While Nasser had merely brought out the shareholders of the Suez Canal Company, he had not actually closed the canal to international traffic. So the claim that it really attacked British interests was not necessarily there wasn't much credibility to it. And so, as Moshe Dayan describes, the plan to hit Egypt in 1956 was, quote unquote, a British initiative. If we look at 1967, it would have been near impossible for the Israeli campaign to be launched and the occupation of the other territories to be launched if it was not for Harold Wilson, Labour government, selling hundreds of British tanks to Israel, which allowed them to follow through with that. You also have Foreign Office archives from that period in 1967 revealing that there was, quote unquote, a disclosure of confidential information about our cluster bomb system to the Israelis in 1967 by the British government. This, of course, would have been massively important for Israel's own cluster bomb program, which, later it seems there were sales of cluster bombs from Israel to the British. Following the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza and Gaza and so on in 1967, and Resolution 242, the British Foreign Office stated, quote unquote, a comprehensive arms embargo for the Middle East would be the best moral position, but I suppose we cannot afford morality nowadays. The British government, as I said before, had sold 500 Centurion tanks to Israel prior to 67. And those were overall, actually from 59 to 1968, they sold weapons to Israel worth £7.6 million. And then in 1967, despite the fact that Israel had not made any movements towards meeting Resolution 242, they did a further deal in 1969 and sold 90 tanks to Israel, despite that. What happened after that was de Gaulle in France launched an embargo on selling weapons to Israel and to the Middle East in general during this period. And so what it did is it forced Israel to start to establish its own capabilities in arms production, developing into what it is today. Of course, in 1973, the UK Atomic Energy Authority undertook joint research with Israel. Now, this is quite interesting because it's said to have kept away from specific forms of development, but this is quite an intimacy and a proximity between a very important institution in the UK and Israel, which is not right. And today we're in a situation where Israel is the world capital of homeland security industries. 20% of Israeli exports are weapons, and 150,000 Israeli families are reliant upon this industry. It was the 8th largest weapons exporter in 2014, and while the United States is the biggest arms exporter in the world, Israel is the highest arms exporter per capita in the world. We know that Israel sold weapons to Rhodesia, Israel sold weapons to apartheid South Africa during embargo, it sold weapons to Chile when Pinochet was in power. $350 million worth of Israeli drones are sold every year. The UK leased Israeli drones for use in Afghanistan in a pay-by-the-hour deal. Now, a very important company in this arrangement and in this equation is Elbit Systems, which wants to treat Britain as a home market. The largest drone project in Europe is the Watchkeeper, and it's between Elbit Systems and Thales UK. Thales UK is a British subsidiary of a French arms giant, Thales, and the drones are being produced by a firm called UAV Tactical Systems in Leicester. Elbit owns more than half of that firm. The engines for those drones, as part of the Watchkeeper drone system between the British government and the Israeli government, the engines are being made by a firm called UAV Engines near Birmingham, which is completely owned by Elbit Systems. Elbit Systems is the parent company of at least 5 companies in Britain, and there is a joint venture now between Elbit and Kellogg Brown and Root, which was established in 2006, and it's called Affinity. It was given a £500 million contract by the British Defence Ministry, and it will provide and maintain aircraft used in military exercises for the British Army until 2033. Another company with a very suspicious relationship with Elbit Systems is Instro Precision. It's based in Kent, and 5 of 8 of its directors are Israeli, and one of them just happens to be the vice president of Elbit Systems. So here we see a really incestuous relationship between Israeli arms companies, British arms companies, between the Israeli military, between the British military. In terms of the 2014 campaign in Gaza, how can any of us forget the betrayal of Nick Clegg? You know, this was someone that in 2009 had been calling for an arms embargo on Israel, but then when he was in the position of the coalition government, he changed his tune completely, and you had £7 million worth of British arms components that were sold to the Israelis around 6 months before the Gaza campaign in 2014. They were signed off for and rubber stamped by the business secretary at that time, Vince Cable. And even Nick Clegg, you know, in 2010, at a Friends of Israel meeting, had told those congregated that he hoped to change the laws around Britain's universal jurisdiction, which prior to that had been a situation where people suspected of war crimes ran the risk of being arrested in England. And he was making that statement to the Liberal Democrats, Friends of Israel, in order to ingratiate himself to them. But this was something that was followed through on. In 2011, the law was actually changed, and now an arrest warrant in these types of situations has to be issued by the Director of Public Prosecutions. So it makes it more complicated if we're in a situation where we want to launch an arrest against an Israeli war criminal that comes here. Not only had Britain sold the £7 million worth of arms to Israel months before the 2014 campaign, they also, literally weeks after the Israeli assault on Gaza, Operation Protective Edge, which included the massacre at Shuja'iyya, sold £4 million worth of arms components within weeks of that massacre. Also, if we look at the siege on Gaza, this is something that involves Britain, you know, and it's violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, but it involves Britain in a more intimate way than we may suppose. There is the Protector naval drones that essentially buttress the siege of Gaza, and they are in cooperation, these naval drones, between the Israeli arms company Rafael and the British arms company BAE Systems. Even in the situation where Britain may not sell arms directly to Israel, we still have the relationship where Lockheed Martin manufactured F-16 called the Fighting Falcon. Has been something that they've been reliant on, contains BAE supplied technology. It's something that BAE boasts about. And now the F-16s are being replaced by the F-35, and that again is something that the rear section of these machines is developed by BAE Systems. David Miliband, while foreign minister in 2009, said that British components had almost certainly been used in Gaza in Operation Cast Lead. Over the past 2 years alone, the UK has approved the sale of over £230 million worth of arms to Israel. The relationship is deep, and you know, we could go on even further. We look at the March of Return today and the way that the snipers are targeting Palestinians who are literally just exercising their right under UN Resolution 194. Britain sells the components of sniper rifles to the Israeli army. They sign off on these things. Now, really, the important part of this is the UK is bound by the International Arms Trade Treaty to assess whether the arms they sell are likely to be used in human rights violations. And there is considerable precedent for what Israel does with the arms that are sold to it. Now, why is it that I'm expounding and labouring this point? Because we are actually in a situation that is quite exceptional, in that we have a leader of the opposition in this country who has called for a review of arms sales to Israel. We have War on One, we have PSC coming out and saying we want to break this two-way incestuous relationship between Israeli arms companies, British arms companies. We now are in a situation where this is something that is somehow within the realms of possibility for us to do. What a lot of the demonization of Jeremy Corbyn is about, specifically using the Palestinian cause as a backdoor to shut down the wider movement, is trying to do to Jeremy Corbyn what happened to Nick Clegg. Now this is something, and avoiding this relies on the groundswell of public opinion, which says actually this is something we want. Now if the important figures within Israeli government have spoken about Britain as a hub of BDS delegitimization of Israel activity, what that implies is that if Britain takes that position, and specifically London, then the status quo is imposed of these trade deals in a dictatorial fashion, because clearly they realize that there is popular base for the opposite policy. And what they're trying to do is create the situation where potentially a prime minister in waiting, we hope, would be locked into certain deals that he wouldn't be able to escape from. So if we consider the movement of power as a variable in a dialectic, have a really essential role in defining that policy, in pushing for that policy. It is realistic, it is possible, and it is a moral imperative. Thank you very much.